I mean to various social science and economic and political organizations. He spoke with advisors to the higher levels of government and the party. He engaged in some very fruitful discussions with them about developments in his own specialty that applied to China. That is, his specialty is world political economy, and in relationship to China, particularly impacts of world political economy on China. So he continued this up to the present time. He just returned from his latest 17-day trip, which he will, I'm certain, tell you something about. So he's well qualified, and as I mentioned on the flyer, he is a very compelling observer of the Chinese scene. So without further ado,
I'm going to get to a disclaimer in a minute. Hey, Al, come sit here, please. I need you.
So, what, you need me?
Yeah. You know. Oh, boy. The disclaimer really being that, one, I'm not a student of China like Al, and some of you here are had the privilege of being invited into what may be important discussions in China. I guess the flyer said that I've been a consultant in some sense, and even that's certainly too strong in that absolutely no pay has been involved, but the understanding really by those inviting me and essentially that we're comrades in humanity's great transition to socialism. And so again, no pay involved, but I've had this extraordinary privilege of being invited into discussions that I think can make a real difference. And sometimes I'm thinking the future of humanity will be written in China. And maybe I'll have a little bit of time to explain, what's behind that statement. But first, really thanks to Niebyl Proctor, to all of the organizers behind this event. Niebyl Proctor came up more than once in discussions at China around the question of expanding and making more effective education in Marxism. I believe that humanity can stand up as a result of this crisis of capitalism the same way that China stood up after the last crisis of capitalism, and the same way that the Russian Revolution emerged out of the crisis of capitalism of 1900, 1907. To do that is going to require an enormous amount of preparation, organization, and education in Marxism on an international scale. We need to be very conscious about this crisis. We need extraordinary development of unity of labor unions and of communist and workers' parties on an international scale. And we need to be conscious of where we're going. And again, education in Marxism and the application of Marxism is critical to this. And therefore, so are centers like this. There aren't many of them that are oriented towards education in Marxism. So your contributions to the center in every way, including your time and efforts as well as funds, can play a real role. So let me also mention the extraordinary work of a China study group in terms of education about China. So if you're not signed up to the China study group listserv, that's very much worthwhile doing. If you want to understand China, the work that the China study group, which originated in Boston, where I'm from, is I think, of great importance. And again, this is not an attempt by China Study Group to criticise China, but to understand China and what kind of social formation it is. So, just before leaving Boston, in mid-November, we had a demonstration around Gaza. In Boston. In any case, this older worker, now retired, but had been an industrial worker, asked me, well, what are you going to do in China? We're marching, there's a lot of noise. And I said, essentially, it's to see about advancing unity of the workers of the world. And he puts 2 thumbs up, which gave me great pleasure. In any case, in one of the presentations in China, the driver who took me there with an interpreter, I asked the driver, what were you doing 10 years ago? And this was an industrial worker. And I asked him, please come in and listen to your presentation. That would mean a lot, and your response would mean a lot. In any event, in the presentation, part of what came up was about advancing unity of the workers of the world. And out of the corner of my eye, I see 2 thumbs up. And I can't tell you the pleasure I got from that. And then the comments and questions that he raised afterwards. It really, that meant a lot to me. So, in any case, I saw at least one of the advertisements for this presentation, a place that is China socialist? And exactly that question was placed to me in what I call my entrance exam to the Central Party School, the Party School of the Central Committee in Beijing. And then the deputy director asked me that point blank. This was in 2004. And by that point, I had reconciled myself. There are certain things that have to be said. I'll try to say them as effectively, but neither do we want to varnish the truth. And my response was, China is the product of the Great Socialist Revolution, October 1, 1949. And there have been enormous achievements since then, really extraordinary. Hundreds of millions emerging out of deep poverty. Extraordinary achievements in education, in a wide range, economy, housing. But I said to her, you can't call this poverty, which is still very much existent in China. You can't call this inequality. You can't call this continued existence of classes socialism. And wondering how she'd react at the Central Party School. And a big smile emerges from her face, and she says, I agree. And she asked me, how do you define socialism? I said, it's the point at which classes, I said to her, I tend to take the political definition of it, which is the point at which classes begin to dissolve, and therefore the state can begin to dissolve. In other words, any form of organized repression of one class by another, in this case, ultimately by the working class, although quite indirectly, which is a problem right now. And then I turned the tables on her. I said, how do you define socialism? She said, socialism, the point at which really people can contribute according to their ability and are paid according to their work, and we're far from that. And communism, the point at which not only people contribute according to their ability, but are paid according, essentially can take according to their need. And we're even further from that. So it was an interesting exchange. So is China socialist? It's still far, far from socialism, but it's the product of a socialist revolution, despite capitalist inroads, despite these problems of growing inequality, not least of women, but in a wide range, city versus countryside, and very concerned in terms of the gap between manual and intellectual labor, and consider that one of the possible fault points at which China could disintegrate. And I've raised that, that communists need to recommit to ending the opposition between city and countryside and between manual and intellectual labor. And there have been discussions about that, and I've raised outrageous, in some senses, challenges in China, and far from getting thrown out, the door keeps opening wider. So one way of picking up that something extraordinary happened in China in 1949 is simply by comparing it with next door India, which was considerably better off than China in 1949. India, huge poverty, but still mild prosperity as a result of war contracts, and didn't suffer the utter destruction that China faced as a result of the Japanese imperial intervention, invasion, wonder, starting in 1931, August 1931, and escalating immensely a few years later. And yet, how many people know this, that income per person in India today is at least 30% lower than it was in 1949. While in China, it's several 100% higher, if not several 1,000%. And there's much more to life than income per person. There's issues of healthcare, there's issues of education. Total illiteracy, especially of women in India, is astonishing. While it has nearly disappeared, certainly among the younger in China, this question of infrastructure, public health. So it's a night and day thing, and 7 years ago, almost 8 years ago, April 2005, the Economist had this cover story and center spread about Asia's two tigers, China and India. And if you searched, and knew to search through that, as I wrote to the Economist, in between paragraphs, there was this admission, and by using different reference points for incomes, this admission that income per person in India was at least 30% lower than it had been in 1949 or 1947, when India emerged from colonial, formerly from colonial dominance. What's even more astonishing is, and also suppressed, the world economic historian, no radical, he was the chief economist for the OECD, Angus Madison, does this extraordinary study that finds that between 1973 and 1995, as he reports, the single time he reports it that I know of, I'm effectively quoting him word for word. Unfortunately, in 144 countries, income per person in this 23-year period, 1973 through 1995, dropped 0.80, average income per person dropped 0.80% per year. And one, Angus Madison, if anybody would know, you don't measure it as average income per person, you measure it as median income. And you have a few multi-billionaires that have risen in India, while there's been this extraordinary fall into deep poverty, and below India's miserable poverty line, in India, close to 150 million people dropping below India's poverty line between 1990 and 1996 as a result of as a result of a collapse of the Soviet Union and adoption of neoliberal policies. And what was the Indian government's response? Is to lower the definition of the poverty line, which even the World Bank, this big supporter of capitalism, rejected. And it's far from measured, but the sheer growth of hunger and malnutrition in India in the last 2 years it's sickening. But on top of that, you know, if you've been to India, which I have, you know, we're talking, you know, almost about a sinking sewer. And if, you know, you have time to spare, there's quite a book about life in a Mumbai slum by Catherine Boo, came out earlier this year, called Beyond the Beautiful Forever. She spent 4 years in that slum, apparently swam in the sewage lake that many people use both for a toilet and to clean up. And what's extraordinary about that is that the very poor exploit the extremely poor within that slum, and the extremely poor exploit the truly desperate. And then on top of that, the police are out there finding one way or another to exploit all of the residents, formally by threatening them or taking them into prison. And so I really recommend that. And as a more general picture of what's happened under capitalism worldwide since roughly the early 80s is a book by Mike Davis, Planet of Slums. And it's very difficult to, without a book like Planet of Slums, to realize that there's been this tremendous capitalization of the countryside in capitalist countries, in Africa, in a good part of Southern Asia, Latin America, that has resulted in effective expulsion of tens, and by Mike Davis's count, over 1 billion people into slums since 1980. About 2/3 of those are what had been farmers and peasants and rural workers who've been just pushed out of the countryside around the capitalist world since 1980. About 1/3 are the result of effectively the deepening of capitalist contradictions, taking the form of IMF structural adjustment programs. There are people like what's happening in Athens now, in Greece, that have been school teachers, engineers, sanitation workers, and the austerity demanded in Africa or in India or in Pakistan or in Bangladesh or, you know, in wide parts of Latin America, Mexico. Effectively, that's the other third. These are people who had reasonably decent housing in the cities pushed out into the slums. So, and again, the greater picture is of the capitalism whose contradictions are growing, deepening, and therefore these extraordinary results. And again, if we want to understand and properly defend China, part of it is the extraordinary achievements in China, without criticizing China as a whole, versus what's happening in the capitalist world. So, highly recommend certainly the Planet of Slums by Mike Davis. There's so much material that could cover. The presentation, the main presentation, I gave about 8 presentations over the 17 days in China, is summarized here. Basically, it starts from a single world economy, 2 social systems interacting and conflicting within the confines of the single world economy. How the economies formed by socialist revolutions are internally regulated in a sharply different way from capitalist economies. So if you look at the Soviet Union, over lengthy periods, you don't see economic cycles. You don't see boom-bust cycles. You see lengthy periods in the 1930s, in the Great Depression years of growth like China's experiencing now, 8, 9, 10% a year, while in many capitalist countries, including the US, there were years where production dropped 15%, the next year it dropped 10%, then climbed 1 or 2%, dropped some more. And here's the Soviet Union growing 8, 9, 10% a year. If anything, then the Soviet leadership makes the error of thinking that they're on another planet, but it's a single world economy. And, you know, then effectively the crisis of capitalism comes knocking on that Soviet door in the form of imperialist tanks. And came close to bringing the Soviet Union down in the fall of 1941, because we're talking about another social system with the support of workers, and certainly understanding that that's, you know, the achievements of the Russian Revolution had to be defended. You know, you have this extraordinary turnaround at a huge cost, but the Soviet Union was decisive in effectively defeating imperialism in that war. And the period then goes on so that we go from crisis of capitalism, near defeat of the Soviet Union, defeat of the Spanish Revolution, to a turnaround in the Soviet Union, Soviet victory, but also revolution in Albania, in Bulgaria, in Yugoslavia, in Vietnam, August 45, in, you know, you can date them, in part of Korea in September of 1948, and again, extraordinarily, October 1, 1949. And the truth is, and as Marxists in China have said to me, effectively, so much of the achievements of China since the revolution were dependent on aid as well as learning from the Soviet Union, as well as trying to figure out problems in Soviet economy in terms of the kind of planning that the Soviet Union tried to carry out. And so in any case, that was very interesting to hear leaders from China tell me about what they owe the Soviet Union, and the great achievements of the Soviet Union with their planning system, the great achievements of China with planning, and then going from there to the problems that China at least was coming up by following the Soviet model of planning, and the reasoning then behind the moves to market, to bringing in market mechanisms and to open up to the world, and then going from there to problems that markets and opening up have brought about. I'm trying to think where to proceed. Some people here, I'm honored, were here at an earlier presentation or heard this presentation last night, and so I hate to repeat myself too much, but